Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Hey folks, I'm Howard Goffman. I'm a staff attorney in EPA's Office of General Counsel and a member of the planning committee for this conference. And it is my privilege to introduce Joe Goffman and Chuck Knauss. They are two of the giants in our field of environmental law. They are also longtime colleagues. In the early years of their career, they each served as star congressional staffers who played essential roles in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Chuck was minority counsel in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, but he received plaudits for his work by the ranking Democrats, John Dingell and Henry Waxman. He has spent his career since then in private practice. He is currently a partner with Hunt Andrews at Kurth. He covers nearly all areas of environmental law, but he has long been one of the most respected Clean Air Act lawyers in the country, and he is a familiar figure in the halls of EPA. He has been recognized by Chambers USA for the past 21 years, and in other ranking publications. If Chuck has spent his career since the 90 amendments doing well, Joe has spent it doing good. During the 90 amendments, Joe served on the staff of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, where he became known as the father of the acid rain title, and with it, the concept of cap and trade. Since then, he has traveled in a kind of career circuit, moving between senior positions in EPA, the NGOs, congressional staff, and academia. His biggest contributions have been in EPA. He served all 8 years of the Obama administration as Associate Assistant Administrator for Climate and Senior Counsel in the Office of Air and Radiation. He worked so closely with Administrator Gina McCarthy and Acting Assistant Administrator Jenna McCabe that those of us at the staff level often refer to the three of them in the singular, as in, at the meeting this morning, Gina, Janet, and Joe told us to go do X. And for the almost 3 years of the Biden administration, he has served as a senior official in the Office of Air and Radiation with the title of Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator. Only a handful of people in the history of EPA have held senior positions for as long as Joe has. Maybe the best way to concisely describe his extraordinary contributions is to say that for the last third of a century, if something happened that was really significant under the Clean Air Act, Joe was probably in the middle of it, and in many cases, the driving creative force behind it. Chuck and Joe?
Howard, thank you very much for that kind introduction of both of us, and for all your hard work over the years implementing a statute that Joe and I spent a lot of time at 33 years ago. Welcome, Joe. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to sit with you and talk about what you've accomplished and what you plan to accomplish in the coming months.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks to Howard as well, who probably knows the Clean Air Act more intimately than either of us ever could because of his brilliant work as an attorney in the Office of General Counsel at EPA.
I want to take us back 33 years just to start. You in the Senate, me in the House, doing the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. We worked really hard to get it to President Bush's desk. That was a success. And as I see it over the past 3 decades, it has been a remarkable success, the statute. And it does seem to be able to accommodate new challenges that we face, given some effort sometimes. How do you see it?
Well, I see it in the same way, and I think hoping that in the course of this conversation, we can think of a particular framework, which I believe is the framework of the Clean Air Act. It seemed to me that the authors, and I'm thinking not only about the members that you and I worked for on the 1990 amendments, but their predecessors responsible for the 1970 Act and the 1977 amendments, really intended the Clean Air Act to be one that followed and drove progress in science, progress in technology and the progress represented by economic growth. And I think that for that reason, your statement a second ago that the Clean Air Act itself was built successfully to take on ongoing and new challenges is absolutely right on target, because it was designed to do that.
When I first cracked open the act quite some time ago, I was struck by the purposes section. It really resonated with me. There was 101B1 talks about the goal of the act to enhance air quality so as to promote public health and welfare, but also the productive capacity of the nation. And so for me, the dual purpose embedded in the Clean Air Act has been a lodestar for me as I worked through different types of Clean Air Act challenges in rulemakings and compliance and other things. What's kind of been guiding you as you go
referred to is actually built into the authorities and mandates that the Act give to EPA in the states. It's not just a kind of one-off enunciation of purposes. Those purposes are then reflected in the way the different provisions work. So the principles that I think the Act itself tells anyone who works in the agency to follow are, again, the principles of progress. Science is I'm kind of going to coin a word here, is a progressive endeavor. We always know more. We collectively, thanks to the work of scientists, always know more today than we knew, say, 5 years ago or 8 years ago. And by coincidence, Clean Air Act tells the EPA, in the case of ambient air quality standards, to review the standards or review the science every 5 years. Also tells EPA to review progress in pollution control and other cleanup technology. And if in both cases there is sufficient progress, either on the science side or the technology side, or with respect to changes in the economy, if there's enough there to take further action, then the agency, by and large, takes that action, because it means that for the people who depend on air quality, and that means everybody for everything, their prospects, their health prospects, their life experience, their economic experience is actually improving on a continual basis.
It certainly is. It's not a static statute.
It's not a static statute, and it's not a static statute. It would be really an anomaly if it were, because nothing else is static, And I won't say that the authors of the Clean Air Act were unique in this regard, but they did a very distinctive job in making the statute as dynamic as the economy is, society is, science is, and technological progress is.
Given its scope, and I've sometimes referred to it as the most far-reaching economic statute, not just environmental statute. And your job, by all accounts, for folks inside the Beltway, is viewed as one of the most challenging political appointee slots. But it also, people don't take the job unless they want to make a difference, because it's a really hard job. And you've done a lot. Maybe just take a minute to recap, what you feel are the high points thus far of your second time around in the air office.
I'm disappointed to hear that it looks like a hard job because I'm not being successful. Actually, it's a very easy job. It just apparently looks hard to other people. Because as far as I'm concerned, you know what this job is? Get to work on time and turn on the lights. Because the real work of the Office of Air and Radiation and the Office of General Counsel that bring reality in terms of public health protection and air quality improvement, the real work is done by the incredible EPA workforce. And so basically the job of the person who leads OAR is to do everything he or she can to ensure that workforce is working under optimal conditions for success. economic challenges and environmental and public health challenges. That was right out there, if you will, all through 2020 as the President Biden headed towards election. And it's remarkable that within hours of being sworn in on January 20th, 2021, he signed a series of executive orders that laid out a remit in this area. And that remit was directed, as a practical matter, towards the Office of Air and Radiation. So I think this may have been the first time that a new leadership in the Office of Air and Radiation arrived with the president himself already having driven home the message that the work of OAR and the mission of the Clean Air Act were President Biden's priorities. He then backed that up by leading the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the American Recovery Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, all of which put the Office of Air and Radiation, it gives us an opportunity to look at our Clean Air Act toolbox now as functioning in a sort of complementary role with a bunch of other significant policy tools.
When you said yes to the job, I bet you didn't think that you were going to be handed billions of dollars. Historically, it's been millions for grant making and other things. Billions is hard to get your head around, and I'm sure it's been a challenge for your team to figure out how to get the money out the door in a responsible fashion, doing effective things.
It's been a challenge, but of course, because it's additional work, but we were given additional resources to do that work. The Office of Air and Radiation and our colleagues in the 10 regional offices do have substantial experience in terms of grant making and issuing rebates as well as grants. The structure of some of these programs that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, and which OAR is lucky enough to be able to administer, focus on building partnerships with other parts of government and other governments. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, for example, it's also more or less the biggest account OAR has, is built around leveraging the resources of state governments and municipal governments. And so, in a way, what our job is to be the catalyst of the agendas and priorities and mission of other state and local government partners. And that means that we have an opportunity to issue grants that really have that catalytic function.
Today we're before the ABA, and so it makes sense to chat for a minute about the courts. You've been in and around over the last decade some of the most significant rulemakings and court cases that have been entertained by the D.C. Circuit and by the Supreme Court. Given the implications of Clean Air Act rulemakings, there's no surprise that some of them end up before the Supreme Court. From my perspective, I have seen a trend, I think, over the last 20 years or so of sometimes the rules seem to appeal to the constituents in a more maybe extreme fashion to see if it's going to stick and force the courts to say no, pushing the envelope, both sides of the spectrum. And how are you viewing, the recent court decisions guiding your decision making on the really big rules that you're going to talk about in a minute?
I think back to Massachusetts versus EPA, and one of the features of the majority opinion, which I believe was written by Associate Justice John Paul Stevens, is that if you look at the language of that majority opinion, you see a perfect crystallization, at least in my view, of what I described a minute ago as the logic or philosophy or mission of the Clean Air Act, one that is perpetually or continually requiring the agency to capture progress in science and technology and in the economy. I wish I could quote by heart what Justice Stevens wrote, but it really is a clear crystallizing statement of that science, that progressive aspect, science in the sense of progress of science, progress of technology, progress of human understanding. Since then, I think, by and large, the agency and the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, have been in an informative and net constructive dialogue about how to interpret and apply language that was last adopted 33 years ago, but at the same time is designed to operate in a changing and dynamic environment. And so when we look at everything from the Michigan versus EPA, where Justice Scalia addressed one aspect of our obligations under Section 112, when we implemented the mercury and air toxic standards, when we looked, at West Virginia versus EPA, what we saw, or what we think we see, is a court giving us a sense of what the contours are, or the way in which we can corral the dynamism and the progress that Congress built into the Clean Air Act, while staying within the role that, at least in the majority's view, Congress intended us to adhere to.
Well, we should probably turn now to the future and what a lot of folks here want to hear. Certain things are reported, but why don't you talk about what you see happening that's important to you over the next 6 months?
Well, I'm glad we got to start with the philosophy part of this discussion. We're sitting here today at a time when, to be metaphorical, the ink is barely dry on the final oil and gas methane rule, which we just promulgated and announced over this past weekend, a rule that applies Section 111 both to new and modified sources in and equipment in oil and gas operations, as well as to existing sources and equipment in that sector. Arguably, that's one of the highest impact rules on the current agenda because it's comprehensive. It addresses methane, which, as you know, is a highly potent greenhouse gas. Gas, as we reduce emissions, will have a perhaps detectable impact on warming. Coming along with the methane reductions are reductions in air toxics and VOCs. So it's not only a climate rule, it's also an air quality and public health rule. And it represents, I think, a truly comprehensive strategy or comprehensive approach for an entire sector, one which continues to be critical to our economy. I think that rule really reflects and is true to what we talked about a minute ago about the, if you will, progress making, progress following, progress driving elements of the Clean Air Act, because it includes, I think for the first time, a regime whereby the industry and the economy can continue to innovate, in this case, in terms of detection of releases and leaks of methane, and new technologies can fit into the compliance regime in a more streamlined way than we've ever been able to do in the past. Getting our regulatory arms around this entire sector required some thinking about how we leverage compliance. So a new feature is what we refer to as the super emitter program, where while EPA retains its core role in ensuring compliance, that program now leverages third-party capacities as well to help fortify compliance with the program. So we start with what I would describe as absolutely standard approaches to technology-based requirements. It's the good old application of best system of emission reduction and emissions guidelines that the states recognize, industry recognizes, and I believe the courts will recognize, is right down the center of our lane. And yet it provides a new approach for accommodating technological innovation and a new approach to compliance. It's a new strategy for ensuring compliance. So, in a way, we've now, as of this promulgation, really set a very high bar for what's to come next. And as you know, we have pending proposals to address greenhouse gas and conventional pollutant emissions from the new light-duty vehicle fleet. We have a pending proposal to address greenhouse gases from the heavy-duty fleet. We have a pending proposal to address CO2 from the power sector. And we have, to name but one of several other priorities, a pending proposal to address toxic air emissions from the chemical manufacturing sector. And our intention is to finalize all of those pending proposals this coming spring. And again, to harness technological progress in all those sectors and to include approaches to fortify actual compliance with the requirements.
I know the methane rule will be looked at closely for exactly that new idea. It was in the proposal as far as kind of deputizing communities to play a different kind of role in enforcement than citizenship. This being able to communicate to facilities and force action directly as opposed to through a governmental entity was a new idea in the proposal. And it'll other sectors will be looking at how that's structured and how it works, because from what you're saying, it's viewed by the agency as a potential model going forward.
I think that's right. If it is viewed that way, and it may be that it's how should I put this, a meta model. I don't know for sure whether we'll be able to precisely replicate some of these features. But now that we have finalized these regulatory innovations in this rule, we now have a bar set that as we look at finalizing the other rules I mentioned, one of the decisional principles is, have we exhausted the ability as appropriate to include either new ways to promote an innovation or new regulatory strategies to ease and create more assurance around compliance with these compliance with these standards. Because that's, really when you're trying to ensure quality of life and public health improvements in an economy that's as dynamic as ours, you really have to capture all that if you're going to be continuing to make the kind of progress on climate and public health that we need to make.
Let me just shift to another topic for you to address. Your allies in clean air regulation, states and regions. Do you want to say a few words about how that's been going during your administration, your time here, as far as partners in promoting your agenda?
That's a really important question that I think is part of the, central to the job description of OAR leadership and our, at least our senior colleagues who work at the regions. The Clean Air Act has been designed from its inception as a partnership structure between the EPA and states. And certainly our colleagues in the regions are extremely focused and sensitive on that. I think to some extent, and I may be engaging in wishful thinking, but I don't think so. There's a lot of muscle memory. There is a lot of there's a network of a lot of relationships that have already been built, and that, you know, the Office of Air and Radiation continues to cultivate. You know, to be sure, in some of our state partners have different and they would in some cases characterize as conflicting priorities. There are sort of now foundational or institutional relationships that are pretty durable and continue to allow us to maintain those partnerships. I don't think I've ever encountered a counterpart from state or local government who does not, on some basic level, want to accomplish the same thing for the communities he or she serves that we're trying to accomplish. And of course, we are fortunate to be able to provide in-kind resources, and now in the wake of the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, we're fortunate to be able to, I think the expression is, put our money where our mouth is in terms of supporting state and local partners pursuing their own and common priorities.
This has been great. Let me get you out of here on this. Final question. Recent presidents have instituted a kind of charming tradition of leaving a letter for their successor with some thoughts. If you might share thoughts you put in such a letter for your successor, be it a second term or a new term. Why don't you end that way?
Well, I've been lucky enough to be able to get out of DC and visit some of our regions. And we've been lucky enough to be able to hire some new staff in each of these regions. And one of those visits, new colleague who'd been on staff for about 6 months, attended a town hall, a so-called town hall meeting that I was leading in the region, and said, "What's your advice for building a career at EPA?" And the advice I gave her is the advice I'd give a successor. It goes something like this. When you come to work every day, either physically or virtually, realize that you are coming into the presence of real role models. And again, whether you are a brand new career employee or a brand new political appointee, the people you're working with, the professionals at EPA at every level, certainly in the Office of Air and Radiation, embody exactly the kind of virtues, skills, talents, and commitments that are essential to success. That's how I feel when I come to work every day for my own part, and for whoever walks into the leadership suites in the Office of Air and Radiation. If that's how he or she recognizes what's happening, then he or she will be successful.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And I think we all appreciate your leadership and commitment to public service.
Thanks, Chuck.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/Envira. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.